From John's Gospel, chapter 15, I'm going to begin with the 9th verse, not at the beginning, but at the 9th verse through verse 17. Hear these words. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I've made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command: love each other. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Gracious Lord, in your great mercy, hear our prayers. Teach us to love in this way. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, I think I have a little video here, a clip that I want you to see. This is a clip, I believe, of the Old Guard at Arlington National Cemetery. Please take a look.
This Memorial Day weekend, the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, honors our nation's fallen military heroes with flags in on the hallowed grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. A tradition that's been conducted annually since the Old Guard was designated as the Army's official ceremonial unit in 1948. Within 4 hours, more than 1,000 Old Guard soldiers will place an American flag at more than 400,000 grave sites to honor every individual buried at Arlington National Cemetery.
Sheila's dad is buried at Arlington. Her mom is with him. Tom Parham, a very close friend of mine, his dad is buried not very far from Sheila's dad. A lot of people that I've served under and served with are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Jesus said this. He said, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." That's what is recorded in our scripture for today. Those who have served on the battlefield or on board a ship or flown over enemy territory or whatever their job called them to do, they understand this probably better than anyone. You know, we know that the Civil War ended in 1865, but it wasn't until 1997 that I think maybe the last shot of that war was fired. Let me tell you this story. In 1997, 2 young boys were playing around with their new Christmas present. It was a metal detector. And using their new toy, they came across a live shell that dated back to the Civil War. The boys' names were Michael and Andrew Zimmerman. They were in Winchester, Virginia. And they didn't know what the shell was at first. They had an uncle, Michael Robinson, and Michael reported poking and banging on the shell as he examined it. Fortunately, nothing exploded. He didn't get hurt or anything. But he called the police to inspect this new find. The police came. They found this strange object, and they recognized it as an old ammunition shell. They exploded it in Robinson's yard, and they created a crater that measured 4 by 5 feet and about 2 feet deep. So it was a pretty powerful shell. Robinson commented, "In a way, it's the last shot fired in the Civil War, so we're glad it blew up in our yard." The Civil War lived on last night. It was 137 years after the Civil War, at the end of the war. Isn't it amazing that a weapon could still be alive and capable of destruction so long after a war. I'm sure in places like Great Britain and Berlin, they find unexploded ordnance from the Second World War all over the place. Yet that seems to be the nature of war. Its effects linger on in the lives of people and a nation for many generations. Ask the children of Afghanistan or Cambodia or someplace like that who've been ravaged, maimed, and killed by millions of landmines left behind and the terrible legacy of war. Ask a veteran of any war who came home maimed or injured because of the war that they participated in. You know, even in a forward-thinking nation like ours, where history seems to matter less than progress, because those who fail to remember history are doomed to repeat it. You know, we've heard that saying before. It's proper to set aside at least one day a year to acknowledge the influence of wars and those who fought in them and those who paid the ultimate price. Memorial Day is such a day. It's a day where we remember all those who have died in our country's many conflicts and the ultimate sacrifice that they paid. Now, I've run in 2 Marine Corps marathons. The Marine Corps marathon starts down below the Iwo Jima Memorial, and then it ends as you climb the hill up to the Iwo Jima Memorial, hang a left, and go 0.2 of a mile. You know, you get to the Iwo Jima Memorial and you're 26 miles and you think, oh no, I still have 0.2 of a mile left to go. It's horrible. But what an inspiring sight. The Iwo Jima Memorial, you know, there were 5 valiant Marines who raised an American flag on the island of Iwo Jima. That's what that memorial is based on. There's a young man at the center of the photo. His name was John Bradley. After the war, John Bradley moved back to Antigo, Wisconsin. Do we have anybody here from Wisconsin? Yeah, of course we do. So he moved back to Wisconsin, married his high school sweetheart, raised a family, and although John Bradley won the Navy Cross for saving another Marine's life, he preferred not to talk about the war. A lot of folks that come back from war prefer not to talk about the war. He absolutely refused to accept the hero adulation that people placed on him as being one of the 5 in the Iwo Jima Memorial. One of the few comments he ever made about the war he made to his young son, James. In response to James's remark about heroism, John Bradley replied like this. He said, "The heroes of Iwo Jima are the guys who didn't come back." Let me share with you, I've shared this before, but I want to share it again, a story from my past. Operation Iraqi Freedom. When you walked in this morning, you saw a picture of Michael Johnson. This is the face that I saw one day. I was the chaplain for 5th Marines during Operation Iraqi Freedom prior to the start of the war in Kuwait at Camp Grizzly. That's what they called our little camp. We held services every Sunday. And as we heard the drumbeats of war getting louder and louder in the news reports and so forth, we kind of knew that it was coming, that it would be very soon that it happened. The drumbeats were getting louder. And as that happened, more and more Marines would show up for worship services because they kind of figured, well, maybe I need to get right with God, and they showed up. The drumbeats got so loud on March the 16th, which was 4 days before the war started. That was the last Sunday before the war. We held services and I served communion, and I think maybe we had over 2,000 people that came to services that day. We had a gospel choir that sang. It was put together by the Command Sergeant Major, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a big, tall African-American guy who's built like Atlas. And I don't know how he got the guys there. Maybe he twisted a few arms, but they showed up and they sang this incredible gospel choir. There was a young black African-American hospital corpsman who sat on the front row of that gospel choir and stood and clapped and sang, and you could tell that he grew up in church. You knew that he loved the Lord. So anyway, I'm serving communion and I'm thinking all kinds of great things like, Lord, let this communion be a strength for these guys. Bless these guys who come forward. Give them the courage and the strength for what they may face. Let them sense your presence in this Holy Communion. So As I'm serving communion, this young corpsman comes forward, and I'm thinking all these thoughts, and the first thing I see as I hand him communion is, this guy needs a shave. Now, you're hanging around with Marines, you're a Navy person, there's a hospital corpsman who needs a shave, you think, this guy needs a shave. Didn't think anything, gave him the communion, went on, and that was that. 4 days later, the war started. And it was after the mother of all sandstorms, that's what we call it. I could not see this mic stand in this storm if I was that close to it. That's how thick the dust was. And 2 days after that, I learned that there was an accidental death. The XO of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines was actually killed by a combat bulldozer in this sandstorm. He was run over. There was a hospital corpsman that was killed during the battle also. So I went forward to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines to see the CO, who was a very close personal friend of mine. His name was Sam Monday. Sam was a lieutenant colonel at the time. Now he's a general. He's the son of Mr. Monday, General Monday, who became the commandant of the Marine Corps. So I went forward to see Sam, and I saw Mark Tanis, my chaplain. I said, Mark, tell me about this hospital corpsman who died. And he says, well, you remember who he was? The tall African-American guy that sat on the front row, clapped his hands, and sang the one that... And I thought to myself, oh my goodness. I was the last person to give him communion. I also learned a story about a guy that was embedded with us, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. He tried to commandeer an Army warrant officer pilot to fly Michael Johnson's body back on his Black Hawk helicopter to the front, away from the front, so that his family could receive his body. Well, I didn't know the power of that interaction until 6 months later. I was home from the war, September 17, 2003. They renamed the clinic at Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego after HM2 Michael Johnson. He was promoted posthumously to second class. So at the Recruit Depot, there's a clinic there. I went to the dedication ceremony, and I had a chance to meet Michael's wife and mom and dad. And I went up to his dad, and I said, you know, Michael was in the gospel choir. I knew he loved the Lord. He clapped his hands and sang, and I'm terribly sorry for your loss, but it gives me comfort to know that he knew the Lord. And with tears in his eyes and a choking voice, he grabbed my hand and he said, thank you so much for loving and taking care of Michael. See, Memorial Day is so important because we pause to remember. You see, you and I don't have what we have today by our own efforts alone. There is no greater myth than that of the self-made man or woman. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude for the freedom we enjoy from the moment we come into this world. There are so many that have gone before us that have paved the way for us to receive what we have. Some of that debt's owed to the young men and women who shed their blood on the battlefield. And many of them gave their lives because they truly believed that the freedom they were fighting for was worth dying for. We must remember them. Today is the day we honor those men and women who didn't come back, the ones who President Lincoln talked about in the Gettysburg Address, who said they gave the last full measure of their devotion. But it's uncomfortable to look back. When we reflect on the honor and the heroism of our soldiers, when we think back on it, we have to face the suffering that they endured. Many soldiers will carry the physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives after they've come back from fighting in a conflict. But these men and women that we remember tomorrow are those who paid the ultimate price. I've talked with a lot of soldiers who still struggle with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I try to talk them through what they've gone through. Let me tell you a story. Lene Hagen's father, Malcolm Amos, he rarely talked about war and his experiences. The family always knew when the memories were weighing heavy on his mind. He would do strange things. They would wake up to find Amos sleeping on the floor. One time he threw his transistor radio out the bedroom window. And Hagen's mother and father slept in separate bedrooms to protect her mother from getting hurt during the father's mood swings. A tough time. Charlie Wyatt's father was tortured by Japanese troops in the Philippines in the 1940s. One of the torture methods is all of his fingernails were pulled out. That sounds pretty horrific, doesn't it? Wyatt recalls that when his father returned from the war, he always, every week, got a haircut and a manicure. Mr. Wyatt found that there was comfort in having clean, well-cared-for hands after he got back. When Leo Thorsness, whose name was on my POW bracelet, I met his daughter when I was at Duke. We became close friends. It's sort of an incredible meeting. He was held in captivity for 6.5 years, and he was tortured about 3 of those 6.5 years. And when he got back from Vietnam, for years he had horrible nightmares. He'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming, and his daughter explained to me how difficult it was for her dad. The nightmares were the enduring effects of the war. Leo passed away last year from leukemia. Saddened to learn of his death. And as was mentioned earlier, 58,000 plus men and women died in the Vietnam War. And thoughts like these come to mind often when we think about their sacrifices. And they flooded me a few years back when Sheila and I and the kids went to Italy and then to France, and I had an opportunity to visit Normandy. I wanted to go because of a number of things, but simply because as an American sailor, I wanted to see, the battleground where these incredible heroic men served. The cemetery there covers 172 acres. It contains the remains of 9,387 Americans, most of whom were killed during the invasion of Normandy and the ensuing military operations afterwards. I've also visited the National D-Day Memorial on the way to Virginia Tech when Aaron was in school there. He was in the Corps of Cadets. He's a former member of the Corps of Cadets. And he noted how carefully, to me, how the Corps of Cadets has kind of adopted this national memorial that's in Bedford, Virginia. They're charged with special relationship and care and upkeep. Bedford, Virginia is about 6,000 people in the town. It's about 200 miles southwest of Washington, D.C. But if you've heard of Bedford and you want to know why that D-Day Memorial is there, it's likely because of the Bedford Boys, were 30 National Guard members, soldiers from Bedford who landed on France's Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. By the day's end, 19 Bedford soldiers died. 4 more died in the Normandy conflict for a total of 23. Per capita, they lost more people than any other place in America, and that's why the D-Day Memorial is located in Bedford on the way to Virginia Tech. Friends, Memorial Day to me is an uncomfortable holiday, even more so for my daughter. Sheila and I were talking about this, trying to remember. She had to deal, because of the nature of her job when she was deployed to Iraq, she had to deal with the remains of those who had been killed in conflict and make sure that they were sent back. So it's an uncomfortable holiday because not only are we confronted with the sacrifices these people made, we're confronted with our responses to those sacrifices. The whole concept of anyone making sacrifices for us, much less dying for us, I think makes us uneasy. And if we confront their sacrifices, then in confronting those, we have to feel some sense of gratitude and humility. Even worse, confronting their heroism forces us to stop and examine our own lives. We have to ask those kinds of questions. Why did they do what they did? Is there any cause worth dying for? And here's the question, would we be willing to do the same? When I went off to war, that was my job. I didn't think anything about it. I just simply assumed that we're doing the right thing and whatever we're doing is appropriate. And I felt that way until I retired and became the pastor over at Sandbridge Community Chapel. Then my daughter and son-in-law both deployed to Iraq. Now, I began to question, is what we're doing just? Is it right? Is it worth dying for? Putting our lives, our young men and women, particularly my flesh and blood, at risk? Now, I'm a veteran of both Desert Storm and OIF, but I'm also the father of a child and the father-in-law of a son-in-law who went to Iraq. Now, thankfully, they came home safe and sound, but there are others who didn't, and still others who came back horribly maimed, some with PTSD. I'm forever grateful for their sacrifices, And those who pay the ultimate sacrifice is what we remember on Memorial Day. And I think it's always appropriate to remember. So this question I asked this morning in the passing of the peace, this concept of heroes, sort of come back into fashion in our day. We define heroes by what they do. That's why, and this isn't a political statement, that's why I stand and will always proudly stand with my hand on my heart when the national anthem is played. Always. It's simply that's who I am. That's how I've been trained. But I support anyone's right to kneel if they so choose. Now, even if I adamantly disagree with them, I support their right to do that because that's their right. I went to war for that right, for them to do that. And in recent times, I think sometimes we've become fixated on celebrities rather than the heroes of our wars. I heard Ollie North say this the other day on a spot on the internet. He says, "My heroes are guys and gals who wear combat boots." David Granger, who's the editor of Esquire magazine, wrote to over 200 prominent people asking them to define heroism. What are your ideas on heroism? And most of those who wrote back claimed they weren't sure what a hero is. The late actor Paul Newman was one of those who was queried. They said, "Well, what's a hero?" He says, "I'm embarrassed. I have no heroes. Nobody that I know of. Everybody I know that I've read about seriously flawed. They've got problems, including myself. The best he could recommend was a good role model. And for that post of a good role model, he chose his dog, Harry." He said Harry's best qualities, according to Newman, are that he's funky, curious, and always of good humor. Now, I never have thought of a hero as someone who is funky, curious, and always of good humor. I think a hero is so much more. So how do we define hero? What makes a hero? And our culture is sometimes so superficial. Maybe we don't recognize heroic qualities anymore. I like this quote by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Borstein. He is asked the difference between heroes and celebrities. He said this: "The hero reveals the possibilities of human nature. The celebrity reveals the possibilities of press and media. Celebrities are people who make news, but heroes are people who make history. Time makes heroes, but dissolves celebrities. Celebrities are people who make news, but heroes are people who make history. Heroes make history." Friends, the qualities of heroism are these, at least I think they're eternal: self-sacrifice, courage, commitment, honor, duty, sacrifice. In today's Bible passage, Jesus adds the most important and integral ingredient of heroism, and it's called love. In these few verses, Jesus gives us a new context for heroism. This is what Jesus says: "My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, but servant does not know his master's business. Indeed, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father I made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. Then my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. This is my command, that you love one another." You know, in the Bible, there are two words that are prominently used for love. One is phileo, and the other is agape. Phileo refers to a brotherly love, an affectionate bond between people, deep friendship. However, agape refers to unconditional sacrificial love. It's interesting to note that in all the biblical commands to love one another, the word phileo is never used. Not once are we commanded to have a brotherly love for one another. But repeatedly we are commanded to have agape love for one another. A sacrificial love for one another. The greatest demonstration of agape love for us was Jesus' willingness to lay down his life for us. And I believe Jesus, in doing that, lays down for us the deeper meaning of sacrifice. You see, the Bible makes it very clear that Jesus knew what he was doing when he allowed himself to be crucified. He could have stopped his suffering at any point, but he chose, and I think it stands as the greatest single act of love in human history. And as Jesus' followers, we are expected to be willing to do the same for others. See, that kind of love is not motivated by our emotions. or feelings. It doesn't come naturally. It's a radical choice to love like that, and that kind of love is true heroism. Now, Secretary of State Colin Powell tells in his autobiography of an incident that happened during Operation Desert Storm. It deeply affected him. You might remember the newscaster Sam Donaldson. He's now like 88 years old. He's retired, but during Desert Storm, he was interviewing a young African-American private, and he asked the question, "How do you think the battle will go? Are you afraid?" The private replied, "We'll do okay. I'm not afraid because I'm with my family." And after he said this, he kind of motioned toward the soldiers who were sitting nearby. A few of the soldiers called out to him. He says, "Tell him again. He didn't hear you." And with even more assurance in his voice, the young private stated, "This is my family. We take care of each other." Now, do you think that young private would be willing to lay down his life for those he called his family? Absolutely. See, because he loved them, and he knew they loved him, and his courage, his commitment, he would do anything necessary to protect them. I've been there. I've seen it. It's amazing. From such devotion come terms like band of brothers. It's kind of interesting. I can remember when I got back from Iraq, I sat down and watched the TV one night, and on HBO they had Band of Brothers Day 2, which was the second episode was Day of Days. This is when they parachuted into Normandy. As I'm sitting there, I'm watching this, my blood pressure goes up, and I start sweating and so forth. And when the episode ended, I got up, got an ice glass, and poured a Coca-Cola into it, and went out and sat in the dark in my backyard in Fallbrook, California. About 5 minutes later, Sheila goes, "Frank, you okay?" And I'm going, "Yeah, I'm just thanking God for what I prayed for when I was in Iraq." And what's interesting about that whole story is, at the end of the Day of Days, the captain, the Army captain, who by the end of the movie becomes a lieutenant colonel, is in a bombed-out church. He said, yesterday I prayed that I'd get through today. Today I pray through that I'll get through tomorrow. And he says, when this war is over, I pray I'll be able to go home and live in peace all of my days. I said, I prayed that prayer. And I think everybody that's been to war on a battlefield has prayed that prayer. But there are those who didn't come home. Just imagine if we in the church had the kind of love that Jesus talks about, that kind of devotion to each other. Imagine if we could point to any member of our church and say, "That's my family, and we take care of each other." Imagine if we could back up those words with loving, sacrificial action. That kind of love would have the power to change not only our church, but our whole society. We would be unstoppable. And those around us who witnessed our love and the kind of love that we have for one another, they'd say, they have something that I really want. Pastor William Stidger tells a story of a man in his congregation who served in the Navy during World War II. One night this man was running a transport across the Atlantic when he noticed a white torpedo trail coming toward his ship. And his ship was manned by hundreds of soldiers, and the potential loss of life had the torpedo hit them would be devastating. Well, nearby, another small ship also saw the torpedo coming, and the captain of this smaller vessel maneuvered his ship between the transport and the torpedo, and the explosion destroyed his ship, and all aboard died. And the man told Pastor Stidger, "Dr. Stidger, the skipper of that ship, was my best friend." And slowly he remarked, there's a verse in the Bible which has special meaning for me now. It's this: greater love has no one than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. What kind of love would be willing to give itself up for another? What kind of love would be willing to die for you and me? Well, I think it's certainly greater than mere human love. It's the love that Jesus demonstrated to show us just how much we mean to God. It's the love we celebrate today, expressed in the example of those soldiers who gave the ultimate sacrifice on the battlefield for our lives of freedom. Pastor Edward Chen writes this. He says, in India, there's a cemetery where the bodies of American soldiers are buried. Over the entrance to that cemetery are these words: tell them we gave our todays for their tomorrows. Well, tomorrow is Memorial Day. And let's remember and let's never forget that our tomorrows were bought with a price. Someone had to pay with their lives so that we might be free today. There's no way we can sufficiently say thank you to them, yet we should try. You know the words of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. There's a great stanza in that says this: as Jesus died to make men holy, let us live to make men free. God's truth is marching on. No greater love hath a man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. May we so love, and may we always remember.